Okay, I'm going to get started. It's such a nice small group. I would come down and talk to you guys there, but I have to stay up here to operate the laptop. So anyhow, yeah, so there'll be a little bit of a distance. So hi everyone, and thank you for coming to the presentation. My name is Mark James, and I'm an associate professor of applied linguistics at Arizona State University. Today I'm going to talk for 20 minutes about recent work that I've been doing on learning transfer and second language writing instruction. And we'll have time then for some questions. I don't have a handout, but I'm going to post my PowerPoint slides and an audio recording of my presentation on my website, which is up there. So please feel free to visit and to access those if you like. I'll put the address up again at the end of the presentation. Okay, so this project is built on an assumption that the main purpose of second language writing instruction is to help students meet writing goals that are beyond the second language writing classroom. So this might include, for example, helping students to develop an ability to write in workplace contexts, like writing business letters and reports in an office, or to write in academic contexts, like writing essays and exams in other courses, or to write in informal social contexts, like writing personal emails and messages on social media at home. And this purpose means that in order to be successful, to help students meet those goals beyond the second language writing classroom, second language writing instruction has to facilitate students' learning transfer. In other words, second language writing instruction has to help students to learn in a way that will affect new learning or performance. Learning transfer is a construct that has been widely studied in psychology, education, and workplace training, and has been highlighted in discussions of second language writing instruction. And empirical research has generated some evidence that second language writing instruction may facilitate students' learning transfer beyond the second language writing classroom. But the number of studies is small, and research designs have typically not showed precisely what role second language writing instruction has played in facilitating transfer. For example, because the research designs have not been experimental. So despite the importance of the topic, we have had a pretty unclear picture about whether second language writing instruction facilitates learning transfer. The goal of today's presentation is to help find an answer to this question. Now, one thing we can do to try to answer this question is to carry out empirical studies that investigate transfer from second language writing instruction settings to whatever target contexts are of interest. For example, to workplace contexts, to academic contexts, and to informal social contexts. And these studies would have to use designs that show clearly what role second language writing instruction plays in any transfer. Now, this is all quite doable, but like any research agenda, it will take time. But in the meantime, I think there is another way we can start to clarify the picture about whether second language writing instruction facilitates learning transfer. And that's by trying to find existing research that has examined the impact of second language writing instruction and that we can examine with an analytic tool called the transfer taxonomy. The transfer taxonomy was developed about 15 years ago to bring clarity to the complicated picture of transfer in psychology research. In that collection of research, there have often been contradictory findings, with some studies reporting that instruction has led to transfer, and other studies reporting that instruction hasn't led to transfer. But the authors of this taxonomy pointed out that trying to get to the bottom of this by comparing these studies was often like comparing apples and oranges because of differences in research designs. So the taxonomy provides a systematic way to look at any transfer that is reported in a study by looking at that transfer along the same 9 dimensions. 3 of the dimensions are about the kind of learning transfer that has occurred. First, whether transfer was specific, like specific facts or concrete step-by-step procedures, versus deeper and more general, like abstract principles. Second, whether the transfer impacted the student's accuracy or the individual's speed or the way the individual approached their work. And third, whether transfer placed minimal demands on the individual's memory, for example, by just asking the individual to recognize something that they had learned, versus placing heavier demands on the individual's memory. For example, by asking the individual to recall something without any kind of hint. And the other 6 dimensions of the taxonomy are about where transfer occurred. For example, to contexts that were close to or more distant from the learning context in terms of subject matter, physical features, time, function, social characteristics, and activity format. So that's what the transfer taxonomy looks like, and it has been used successfully to analyze studies in psychology. And I had also previously used it a few years ago to analyze studies in a related area of second language education, English for academic purposes education. And that had worked well. So with that in mind, it made sense to try using it again here with another body of existing research on second language writing instruction. Now, one point to stress here is that the body of existing research that I analyzed did not focus explicitly on transfer. As I mentioned earlier, the body of existing empirical research that does focus explicitly on transfer is small, and studies typically lack much of the detail that the taxonomy would focus on. But there is another body of existing research that can be analyzed with the transfer taxonomy, and that's empirical research that has examined the learning that has resulted from second language writing instruction. This works because, first, while the explicit focus may have been learning, the findings can be seen as having demonstrated transfer. For example, if a research design involved exposing students to some kind of second language instruction treatment, second language writing instruction treatment, like some way of giving corrective feedback, and then testing students to see what they learned, students' performance on the test requires application of learning in a new situation, and that is transfer. Second, although these studies don't show transfer occurring to distant targets like workplace contexts, other academic contexts, or informal social contexts, the transfer that occurs does occur across various kinds of boundaries like time, space, activity format, and these can be similar to the kinds of boundaries between second language writing classrooms and other distant target contexts. And third, many of these studies have involved experimental research designs. This means that there is often substantial detail in these studies that can help reveal the circumstances of transfer and the role that second language writing instruction has played. So in fall 2017, I gathered a collection of studies to analyze with the transfer taxonomy. I used the ERIC online database to search for, mainly the ERIC online database, to search for studies that A, involved some kind of instructional intervention meant to improve second language writing ability. B, used an experimental or quasi-experimental research design and showed that instruction had led to learning that students could demonstrate. In other words, there was evidence of transfer. C, they were published in a peer-reviewed journal or a book. And D, they provided enough detail about the research design that they could be analyzed with the transfer taxonomy. And using this procedure, I found a total of 47 suitable studies. I should point out here that the presentation summary in the conference program says that the analysis involved 75 studies, but that was written at an earlier stage of the project when I anticipated there being a larger number of suitable studies than there actually has turned out to be. Anyhow, these were the 47 studies that I was able to analyze with the transfer taxonomy. And just another reminder, as we'll start to dig into some detail here, I'm claiming that what all 47 of these studies show is that second language writing instruction has facilitated transfer of learning. And therefore, the details of these studies can be teased apart to tell us more about that transfer. So we'll take a look at those details now to see what patterns emerged. I'll present the results of this analysis on a series of tables, one for each of those 9 dimensions of the transfer taxonomy. And after that, we'll take a look at a couple of summary slides. The first dimension in the taxonomy is about the kind of ability that transferred. And here I put studies into 2 main categories, specific and general. The specific category was for studies in which transfer involved students' abilities to write letters, characters, or words, to spell, to punctuate, to include specific features of a text format, like a letter's salutation, and to include specific facts about a topic. So with studies in this specific category, transfer can be seen as relatively narrow and concrete. On the other hand, the general category was for studies in which transfer involved abilities to include themes, to develop content, to organize, to use grammar, and to be pragmatically appropriate. So with studies in the general category, transfer can be seen as relatively broad and abstract. And besides specific and general, I had to put quite a few of the studies into an unclear category because students' performance had been evaluated using some kind of holistic score. So it wasn't clear what particular second language writing abilities had transferred. Here's the second dimension, and it's about the kind of impact that transfer had on students' performance. Here I put studies into three main categories: accuracy/quality, speed, and approach. The first category, accuracy/quality, was for studies in which transfer appeared in students' accuracy with grammar, word choice, spelling, and punctuation, or in the quality of their content or organization. The second category, speed, was for studies in which transfer appeared in the numbers of ideas, clauses, or words that students produced in a given amount of time. And the third category, approach, was for studies in which transfer appeared in the combination of themes that students wrote about, or in the complexity of their writing, or in the kind of vocabulary that they used. This third category wasn't about being right or wrong, or being quick. It was just about whether students approached an activity one way versus another way. Here's the third dimension, and this one is about whether transfer involved being shown and just having to recognize what had been previously learned, or having to recall what had been previously learned. Most of the studies involved recall that was relatively unguided, without hints, for example, by giving students an open-ended writing task. Many other studies involved recall that was partially guided, with some explicit hints about what was expected to transfer. For example, telling students to remember to include particular kinds of information or to use a particular generic structure. A few studies involved recall that was relatively guided. For example, by having students listen to a text and try to reproduce it in writing. And in a few studies, transfer involved recognition, by telling students to read and copy a text, or to choose grammar mistakes in a sentence. Now we move to the fourth dimension, and this is where we shift from the kind of transfer, which is what the first three dimensions were about, to transfer distance, which is what this and the rest of the dimensions will be about. So here, this dimension, number 4, deals with the subject matter of teaching and testing activities. And I categorized studies as near if the teaching and testing activities involved the same topic. For example, because for testing, students had to revise some writing that they had done in previous activities. So it was the same topic. And I categorized studies as far if the teaching and testing activities didn't involve the same topic. And I categorized quite a few studies as unclear because the subject matter of teaching or testing activities wasn't clear. Here's the fifth dimension, and it's about physical features of the transfer situation. I categorized most of the studies as near because teaching and testing activities had occurred in the same location and were overseen by the same people. For example, because the study occurred in an existing course and the course instructor had done the teaching and the testing. I didn't categorize any studies as far because it wasn't clear in any studies that teaching and testing activities had occurred in different locations or were overseen by different people. And I categorized a few studies as unclear because there wasn't enough information to be confident about putting them into one of the other two categories. The sixth dimension is time, and this has to do with the amount of time between teaching and testing activities. I categorized studies as near if transfer occurred up to 1 week after the end of the given period of instruction. And I categorized studies as far if there was a delay of more than 1 week between instruction and testing. And this included studies in which the delay was up to 10 months. The seventh dimension is function, and this has to do with the purpose of teaching and testing activities. As you can see, I categorized all studies as near, and that was because in all studies, students had been told that the purpose of teaching and testing activities was research, or because I thought it was likely that the students saw the purpose of teaching and testing as the same. For example, because the study took place in an existing course, so students saw the purpose of all activities as for the course. The eighth dimension, social characteristics, has to do with whether teaching and testing activities were done individually or involved some kind of collaboration. I categorized many studies as near, and in almost all of those studies, it was because the teaching and testing activities were all done individually. But I categorized even more studies as far, and for all of those studies, it was because the teaching activities involved some kind of collaboration. For example, students receiving oral or written feedback on their work from classmates or the teacher, while testing activities were all done individually. Finally, the ninth dimension is activity format. Here I categorized studies as near if teaching and testing activities had a similar general format. For example, they all involved filling in blanks, or writing paragraphs, or writing essays, or writing a description of a set of pictures, or timed free writing. On the other hand, I categorized studies as far if teaching and testing activities had different general formats. For example, testing activities involved writing an essay, but teaching activities had involved listening to a lecture, or participating in a discussion, or doing research, or reading feedback. So those were the main details to come out of the analysis. So let's start tying this back to the main purpose of this analysis, which was to try to clarify the picture that we have of whether second language writing instruction can facilitate learning transfer. This table gives a summary of what the collection of 47 studies showed in terms of transfer distance, which was the last 6 of those 9 dimensions that we just looked at. And what we see here is that, starting from the right side of the table, none of the 47 studies had transfer that was far on all 6 dimensions, or on 5 of the 6 dimensions. None of the studies showed that. But we see that in some studies, transfer was far on 4 dimensions. In some studies, it was far on 3 dimensions, and so on. And in the bulk of the studies, in 18 of the 47 studies, transfer was far on 2 dimensions. I find this table interesting because what it is showing is that not only can second language writing instruction facilitate transfer that is very near, which is what we see on the far left side of the table, but it can also facilitate transfer that is far in multiple ways, which is what we see as we move across to the right side of the table. And this slide brings us back to the first 3 dimensions from the transfer taxonomy. Those were the 3 that were about the kind of transfer that occurs. What we've learned in this analysis is that the transfer that second language writing instruction can facilitate can involve different kinds of abilities, including those that are relatively specific, like abilities to write letters, characters, words, to spell, to punctuate, as well as those that are more general, like abilities to develop content, to organize, and to use grammar. This is interesting, for example, because while we might expect relatively mechanical abilities like spelling and punctuating to transfer quite readily, our expectations might be different for abilities that are less mechanical, like developing content and organizing writing. But the results of this analysis show that second language writing instruction can facilitate transfer of different kinds of abilities, specific and general. We've also learned that second language writing instruction can facilitate transfer that shows up in different ways in students' performance, including the student's degree of accuracy or quality, which is what we saw in the majority of the studies, but also in the students' speed and in their approach to doing activities, which is what we saw in a few of the studies. And we've learned that second language writing instruction can facilitate transfer not only when students have explicit hints and just have to recognize something that they've learned, but as we saw in the majority of the studies, transfer can also occur when situations are more open-ended, with few, if any, hints, and it's up to students to recall anything that they've learned. That's a real positive because outside the second language writing classroom, the writing situations that students face will probably often be relatively open-ended and hint-free. So transfer would have to happen spontaneously rather than because students are told to do so. So with that in mind, I think this application of the transfer taxonomy has revealed quite a bit about what is possible for second language writing instruction in terms of facilitating learning transfer, and therefore has shown that second language writing instruction can achieve the central purpose of helping students to meet writing goals that are beyond the second language writing classroom. So that's the main stuff that I wanted to cover. At the end of these slides, I have a series of slides that are the reference information for the 47 studies. And there's the location again where you can find if you want to take a look at the slides and listen to the recording again after the presentation. That's where it'll be. So thank you. We have about 10 minutes for some questions. Or it was such a good presentation. It covered all of the information you guys needed. We're good. Paul.
Can you explain the difference between mere learning and learning transfer?
Yeah, it's it. I hope I can. If I can, I may be the first person who can give a really clear, definitive answer, because I think that question has been difficult for people to try to answer, and the published work that has looked at this question, what's the difference between learning and transfer? There's been some variation in how folks have interpreted this. So I've seen it described as having a fuzzy border between learning and transfer. And yeah, I think whatever answer that I can offer, there will be folks who would disagree. But some of the discussion has suggested that, for example, if we're going to call something transfer, it has to be over a certain distance. You know, this is one way that we can distinguish between learning and transfer is by deciding that, for example, if a student is able to demonstrate something, to perform on a task which is very, very similar to previous tasks, we might call that a demonstration of learning. We might not call that transfer, but if the task is different in ways like we see on the transfer taxonomy, the more different it is, the farther we can move away from learning and calling it transfer. But another angle on that, I think that's a difficult thing to decide because, you know, where is the line, right? If we say, you know, learning is if it's very, very similar, if a task is very similar to previous tasks, the student's performance on that task is, we're not going to call that transfer because it's too similar. But on this task, which is very different, we're going to call that transfer. It's a difficult thing to decide because this is all relative. Another angle on that might be to say that, you know, any performance, in any situation that we are in, our performance is transfer because it is a new situation. We're always in new situations just because of time. We've never been here before. So, you know, and this is the way that I'm looking at things here. I think we can make that argument. It may, you know, there's going to be people who would argue with that and say, well, then what's learning? But I think that there's some value in looking at every situation as a new situation.
So would it be fair to say that there's a continuum between learning and transfer?
It has been said this way. Sure, it has. Yeah. And I think that's what the transfer taxonomy, I simplified things here because I put things into categories, near, far. And that is oversimplifying things. This is kind of an initial look. The taxonomy is set up in a little bit more complicated way. The authors describe these as continuum. You know, we've got these continua. And, you know, there's near, a little farther, and really far, and we can stretch things out. So I think, yeah, some people would agree that we can say this is closer to like learning, and this is closer to transfer. The more we go along here, absolutely. Was your hand up, Richard? No. Okay, please, yeah. No problem. Yeah.
Experimental research tends to operate in very small time frames. So you're doing post tests like 2 weeks is the delay.
Yeah.
What would the time frames? Because I think an important consideration would be, does this transfer across time?
Absolutely, yeah.
And I just want to maybe go back a little bit.
I'll put that slide back up as we're talking about it. And the way that I went about this, and I, by the way, I think that there are different ways you can interpret these 47 studies. This is the way that I've done it and decided, I'll put studies in the near category because the post-test occurred up to 1 week after the end of instruction. Anything longer than that, I'm going to put it in the far category. So, we can have a discussion about whether that makes sense, and there's reasons why I did it that way, but there may be reasons for doing it a different way. In any case, the far category with this group of studies, the longest was 10 months. A post-test. Yeah, this was a delayed post-test. But that was one study, and there were, I think that one involved measures at 10 months, 8 months, over a few months. But then most of the studies, it's a matter of a few weeks in the far category. But this is one of the things. This is one of the points that comes up in the discussion of learning transfer in the psychology research, which is there's a large body of studies that has looked at these kinds of questions, and many of them have not showed transfer where folks are hoping that they'll see it, because the designs have often been experimental. Well, they've mainly been experimental, but over short periods of time. And so one of the questions that has been raised is, well, what happens if we extend, how do we know transfer is going to occur right after instruction? Maybe it shows up 10 years down the road, right? So does that mean that instruction has failed? So these are some interesting questions, and it becomes difficult then from a feasibility perspective in terms of the research design. But the farther in the future that we can see evidence of learning showing up, the more we can say, yeah, there's far transfers happening. Searching.
I think it was the distance in subject matter.
Mm-hmm.
2 slides before this.
Mm-hmm.
I saw a lot of studies were categorized as unclear.
Yeah.
Could you give us a little bit more examples of that?
Sure.
I think those studies were not categorized near.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what were those
Why, right? What did they look like? Yeah, good question. This was one of the dimensions that I struggled a little bit more with, and I'm going to struggle with it more after I finish up here and try to do some more work with this project, because deciding what a similar or different topic is seems for some reason to be trickier than some of the other categories. I think they're all tricky because this is all relative, right? When we're talking about similar and different, there are no absolutes here. I mean, this is all, it's all relative. So anyhow, with the topic, a lot of the studies that I put into the unclear category were there because they were described in the research, not based on topic, but on genre. So, we're going to, in this study, we're going to have the treatment's going to involve students writing this type of, practice writing this type of text. And when we test them, we're going to have them write this type, essays or reports, things like this. And they didn't talk about the topic. In some of those unclear studies, it was because students got to choose topics. The research design involved, a treatment in which students chose what topics they were going to write about, and the test may have involved the same thing. They get to choose a topic. So it's impossible for me to categorize it as near or far. It may have been identical. It may have been totally different, but I didn't know. Those were two of the types of those are two of the reasons why I put studies into the unclear category. Quite a few studies were like that. Please, yeah.
My question's about kind of the antithesis of this, because you're looking at instructional interventions that lead to transfer.
Yeah.
But what about, and you're looking for positive transfer, but what about what we might classify as negative transfer?
Uh-huh.
And in writing, a good example is the kind of intensive preparation that students undergo to prepare for an AAAL independent writing task or a TOEFL independent writing task.
Yeah.
And then when students get into writing classes or other disciplinary classes where they're supposed to engage with different genres, they try to turn everything into a for and against or a pro and con essay.
Absolutely.
Because it's so strong.
Yeah.
That even though may have had other instruction, that seems to override it.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. I think we can look at. Thank you for the question. I think we can look at that a couple of ways. One is that is when that happens, it's still transfer. I actually didn't look for studies that were all positive.
Right.
I looked for studies that showed transfer, and if there were studies that had showed this, I would have included those here. And where it comes up, I think most directly would be in relation to this dimension. What kind of impact did transfer have? Does it have an impact on performance in terms of accuracy, quality? Does it have an impact on performance in terms of speed? Does it have an impact on performance in terms of approach? But even when we sort of tease things apart using these three categories, we still don't get into, what kind of, is it a positive or a negative impact? I mean, it's possible that instruction could have an impact on speed, which is transfer. It could cause students to write more slowly. In fact, that has come up in some of the empirical research that I've done, where students have explained to me when I've done interviews with students, asking them, has this course, this writing course, helped you in other courses? Students have sometimes said to me, well, I've tried to use some of the stuff that I learned in the writing course, but it actually makes me work slower when I'm in my other course, because I have to think about things that, extra things that I wouldn't have thought about before. In any case, that's just an example of what I think we can add on to this dimension, which is, to look at whether it's a positive or a negative impact. Yeah. But this analysis didn't go that far, but that's an important question. That's where we're not looking just at transfer. We're looking at the impact that it has beyond, whether it's speed, accuracy, or approach. Looking at sort of our judgment of that transfer, whether it's a positive or negative. One label that I've seen used for what this is, I like this label, talking about students, applying what they've learned all over the place, which is something, we hope that happens when we're teaching, that students will transfer learning. Not as much as this, though, but I've seen it referred to as overzealous transfer. I like that label, just overzealous. The students are very enthusiastic about what we're teaching. I think we're probably out of time. I'm happy to stick around. I don't think there's anything else in this room afterwards. I'm happy to stick around if any other questions come up. But otherwise, thank you. And I will put the slides on that website right there. But thank you very much for coming.